People who live in transit-oriented developments that are walkable and mixed use are able to live near amenities. That means that they don't have to get in their car. They're using their cars less frequently and for shorter trips. I moved away though, I did. So I've lived other places. Moved away when I was 18 to go to school in San Francisco. Lived in Oakland for a number of years. And lived in LA for a year. Was driving back and forth from LA to Redlands to visit my family because I have a pretty large family here. And we just got sick of making the drive and decided. We're actually sitting in this coffee shop when it was Augie's, yeah. Visiting and like kind of like joked like, you know what, we could buy a house in Redlands, and we were like, oh, ha, 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 ha. That's ridiculous. And then like 6 months later we moved here. So
how long have you been like living in Redlands, in a house in Redlands? I've been in my house that we bought for almost 5 years. Okay.
So yeah, and I think we moved here maybe almost 6 years ago.
Yeah. I'm not a lifelong Redlandser either. So.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter. I don't think it really matters in the conversation. There's a lot of that going on because I think there's a lot of people, rightfully, I mean, that's what I'll say about this whole debate or conversation around Measure G. I think one of the biggest things is that there's a large community of people who live here who feel very passionately about Redlands. And everybody has a different idea of what makes Redlands. Yeah. If that makes sense. And I have found that the conversation has strayed considerably from what Measure G actually does to just all of the ways that people feel about Redlands, how long they've been here, where they live, and how they envision the future.
Yeah.
And it goes both ways, good and bad, I guess.
Yeah. It becomes less about the subject and more about don't ruin my Redlands that I want. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I mean, I understand it. Like, I grew up in Redlands, and sometimes when I see like a new building or new development go up, or when I see some orange groves go down, you feel that. You feel nostalgic. Oh, that's so sad. Like, don't take away my, orange groves. Or like, oh, this was always this way. I can't. It's hard to see it change.
Yeah.
It's like even when they put the Sprouts shopping center up. I have family that actually lives right on Lawton Street, and they've lived there since before the freeway was put in. Mm-hmm. And so I'm very familiar with that area. And it was hard not to feel a little bit emotional about the fact that it was going to be something different than it was my whole life. Yeah. But now I love it, and I go there all the time. So,
right.
It's hard, right? Like, change is scary, but it's also inevitable. Yeah. And I think that's part of the conversation. It seems to me like a lot of people think that voting no on G means no on change, or no on population growth, or no on new housing, but none of those things are actually true.
Yeah.
Measure G is literally about land use policy. It's actually very simple, and maybe because it's so simple, people are able to insert a lot of ideas, fears, etc. into what it could mean. Potentially taking the train to work, because a lot of people that live in Redlands commute to places like Los Angeles for work.
Yeah.
And so this gives people the opportunity to avoid the traffic that they're seeing on the the freeways. Take the train. So it's really just about where to put the housing.
Okay. Now let's do it for the camera. Okay.
I don't know if I can repeat. No, I can't. Trust me, I can't.
No, you don't have to repeat everything. So this is Erin Hagstrom. Mm-hmm. She is a social media guru, content specialist, and she was on season 3 of Restored.
That's right.
With Brett Waterman. And so she's gonna give her pitch for Measure G. What is Measure G?
Measure G seeks to eliminate some of the slow growth restrictions on a very specific geographic region in Redlands that's based around the transit areas now that the train station is being built. That's pretty much all it does, which obviously sounds a little bit scary, but there is a plan. The Redlands Transit Village's specific plan is what the city would then be allowed to legally adopt in its place. So I think sometimes people think that Measure G is going to just completely lift all regulations. That's just not true. It's going to make it legally possible for the city to adopt this specific plan that was very thoughtfully designed over the course of years with consultants, city staff, and direct input from citizens who live in Redlands. And if you haven't seen the plan, you need to look at it, because that's literally what sold me on Measure G. I knew that I was voting yes when I saw that plan.
Okay, and that's on the city website, the plan?
If you go, it's actually redlandstransitvillages.org.
Okay.
And I think the city put it together.
Yeah.
If you go to resources, you kind of have to scroll. It's not super easy to access, but you can scroll down to, under resources. You can see some really beautiful draft plans. They're from the workshops that were that the city held with community input, and so you can see basically where the plan is at right now. And it's not the final draft, but it gives you a really good idea of what's going to be instituted if Measure G is to pass.
Okay. One of the things that I think maybe people have a problem with Measure G is it's a very large space. So I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Sure.
It's a very large space, and so it does include some like regular single family housing. So if it was a smaller space, like if it was only just the downtown, like strictly downtown around the business district, I feel like it might have a little bit broader support because it's not going to encroach on people's homes. What's the way that maybe this measure is not going to affect people's single family houses?
Yeah, so I think if you just look at the geographic region that Measure G is proposing to lift these regulations from, it does affect, the city center. And if you look at that, it's hard to imagine what's going to happen there. But if you look at the Redlands Transit Villages specific plan, it was designed very thoughtfully to honor the historic charm of Redlands, to honor the existing buildings around it. It was designed using form-based codes, which is something that I had to learn about. This is not something that I knew about. But what it means is the building heights need to honor the buildings around them. So for example, if there was a single family home in any zone, the building beside it cannot be larger than 2 stories, which is already what the regulations in Redlands are. So it really honors not only the architecture, but also the heights of the buildings around it. So it's very sensitive to the existing structures. One of the reasons that people talk a lot about the Redlands Mall is because that would probably be the largest place where we would see changes, because it's this huge piece of land right smack in the middle of downtown. Yeah. And I don't think anybody wants that to stay.
No, I don't think so either.
The conversation gets focused around that because I think it's easy for us to all agree that that's a part of the city that really needs to be revitalized, redeveloped. And the Redlands Transit Villages specific plan envisions something really great for that area. It's all about creating a walkable, mixed-use, transit-oriented development, which means that there's going to be retail on the ground floor with offices and apartments above, so that people who live there don't actually have to get in their cars to go, to a restaurant, to the grocery store, or to hop on the train to commute to work. What the specific plan aims to do is to help Redlands meet the new housing development requires that are established by the state. Redlands has to have a plan for a certain number of units, of housing units, to be built in the city. And it's important to remember that most of the city is only zoned for single-family homes. We can meet those housing needs in a more thoughtful way, in a very planned and thoughtful way that honors the historic charm of Redlands by adopting the specific plan. Yeah. So it's a no-brainer for me. And I think besides that, I have a young family. I actually live less than half a mile from the downtown train station. So I think that I'm one of the few people that's probably more affected by the plan than most, because there's not really a lot of single-family residential homes that are within the area.
Yeah, very few.
There's very few properties. So, and I live within it, and I'm excited about it because I bought that house because it was so close to downtown. I wanted to be able to walk with my family. I have young children. I push them in the stroller. We come downtown, and I live on the other side of the mall, and so it makes the experience very unpleasant for us. It's not walkable. I have to walk around this massive, like, empty structure that's just decaying and falling apart. There's really not infrastructure for, families that are wanting to walk, or like people with mobility issues, for example. And, it's really depressing to see that it's just sat in that same state for 10 years, right? And so the idea that Redlands can finally develop that area is really exciting to me. I want to be able to walk with my kids to, all of the shops. I mean, maybe even live there. I don't know. I mean, I bought my house, so I don't know if I would actually move in, but it would be very enticing for me.
What would you say to people that they like hear all the stuff that you're saying, and it sounds good, but they just don't want any more people in Redlands?
Well, unfortunately, there's nothing you can do to stop the growth that's happening in Redlands and in California. Redlands doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's a housing crisis in California, and something like 76% of people who live in the Inland Empire do believe that there is a housing crisis, because there is. And the fact of the matter is that the state does have requirements that Redlands needs to meet, and with some of the legislation that is coming down, it prioritizes cities that have a plan in place already, so that they don't come in and force you to just build housing without a plan. So Redlands has created this plan. It's a very thoughtful plan, and it helps us meet those housing requirements in a very thoughtful way. And there's a lot of positive effects for that. So I think if people don't want Redlands to grow, there's no legislation that's going to make that happen for them. So I think it's important to, accept the fact that growth is going to happen. Are we going to take local control over what that growth looks like? Or are we going to allow the state to do it for us? Or are we just going to have no plan and just continue to watch the nature areas around town, get plowed down and plop a bunch of single-family houses in them?
Which Measure G doesn't say that can't happen. So that could happen, and you could also build up downtown too, theoretically.
Yeah, so theoretically, but and this is the part that's tricky, and I think the part that's scary, right, is that we can't speak in absolute terms about what's going to happen if Measure G is to pass, if the Redlands Transit Village's specific plan is to pass. There's a lot of things that we don't know about the future. So a part of it is putting trust in city officials, city staff, consultants who've worked on it for years, and also even the opinions of people who live here about what we want Redlands to look like. We do have to put a certain level of trust. It is out of our hands to a certain extent. We don't know if maybe another state law is going to pass that's going to override and say that none of this can apply, right? But for me, at least, having a plan now, getting ahead of it, controlling what the development is going to look like, I think is going to be a lot more beneficial to Redlands than just waiting for something to get handed down to us.
So you don't think if people vote no on Measure G and they are waiting for maybe a better option to come along, do you think that's going to happen?
Well,
I mean, you probably don't, but I mean, that's probably what people are thinking.
This is something that I've heard. I think people believe that if they vote no, then the city's going to go back, they're going to draft another measure, and that it's going to be something like some sort of compromise. But that simply is not in the works. The mayor has already expressed that if the city votes no, then the city has spoken. The city does not want to see transit-oriented development downtown, and there will not be another measure proposed. And we'll just wait to see what the state decides.
Okay. But they're already building the trains anyway, so the trains would go to nothing.
So the train, exactly. And I think that's exactly. The reason that the Redlands Transit Village's specific plan was created is because the train is coming. That is happening no matter what. It's going to open in 2022, fingers crossed.
Right.
So excited about it. But one of the things that is important to understand is that in order for this type of, in order for the train even to be successful for the community, you need to create transit-oriented development around the train line so that people can live in those apartments and take the train to work. Even if it's just one day a week, that's eliminating another car from the freeways. It's eliminating some of the traffic and pollution problems that we're experiencing in California. So, but it is important that there is a more concentrated development of housing near the trains in order to make that successful, in order to keep the train running with the frequency that it needs to be running on, in order for this to be successful. There's a lot of other things I can go into in terms of safety as well. I thought it was really interesting to learn that like a 4-story building is actually safer than a 2-story building in terms of apartments, because there's more eyes on the street. So when there's more residents living nearby, it actually makes it safer. There's less crime because there's more people watching the street at all times.
Okay.
It's usually when there's like dead zones, just certain times of the day when there's no people present. That's usually when there's going to be more crimes happening, essentially.
But so say they destroy all of the Redlands Mall and they build mixed-use businesses on bottom, apartments and things on top. There's naturally going to be a lot more traffic though in this downtown section.
So I'm probably not the best person to talk to about traffic because I've never experienced traffic in Redlands.
Okay.
I've noticed that there's traffic around the freeway on-ramps and on the freeways, but I wouldn't necessarily, maybe this is because I've lived in other places, but I've never experienced traffic in Redlands specifically.
Redlands traffic in comparison. Yeah.
So I hear that concern, I understand, but the important thing to note is that there's going to be more cars on the road no matter what. Redlands is going to continue growing. Where you put those houses, that housing is going to have an impact on traffic, and I can tell you right now that single-family housing sprawl creates much more traffic. People who live in single-family homes on the edges of town have to get in their car for every single thing they do when they leave their house. If you need to do any errands, if you need to go to the grocery store, you don't have the option of walking to the grocery store. You have to get in your car. If you need to go to the doctor's, you need to go to the hair salon, you're getting in your car for every single trip. People who live in transit-oriented developments that are walkable and mixed use are able to live near amenities. That means that they don't have to get in their car. They're using their cars less frequently and for shorter trips. And that it actually helps to mitigate traffic.
Okay. I actually used to live in an old apartment right next to downtown, so I would walk all over the place too. So I've experienced that myself. Is there any like last pitch that you would give to people who are anti-Measure G that you would want to try to tell them this is what it's really about? And
I mean, I think sometimes people want Measure G to be this catch-all measure. People have a lot of concerns. They want those things written into Measure G, and I hear that, but I think it's important to understand that Measure G is really just about land use policy. It's really just about deciding, hey, we have all these houses, they need to be built. We have these housing needs. Where are we going to put them in the city? Do we want to concentrate those near the train station, near the downtown core, or do we want to continue to just increase single-family housing sprawl on the edges of town, destroying the nature areas around us? I think when it comes to any other concern that people have, things like housing affordability, for example, there are other ways to tackle that. We don't have to use Measure G to tackle those things. We can still go to the city council. We can still go to planning commission meetings. We can still go to city council meetings. We can still communicate and express our concerns about some of those other things. Addressing the homelessness issue, for example. That's something that's huge. Measure G is not going to be the solution to that. It's not going to be the solution to housing affordability. But I'll tell you what, if we don't build more houses, we can't even have a conversation about housing affordability.
Right, because it just goes up. So in the end, if people vote on Measure G, they still have the opportunity to decide what goes there. So I think that's the other important piece to remember. When you read the language of Measure G, it can seem a little bit scary because it says that it just completely lifts all of these restrictions. But those are actually restrictions that were put in place by a specific set of measures. Just because those measures exist doesn't mean that there aren't other regulatory laws that govern what can happen in the cities. They're not going to suddenly start knocking down historic buildings. And as a matter of fact, when the mall was built, there was the La Posada Hotel. Most people know about it, and they really lament the fact that we knocked down the La Posada Hotel to put in the Redlands Mall, which ended up to be this the Redlands Mall is so beautiful.
Huge disaster, right? And what I think people don't realize is that the La Posada, if somebody wanted to build the La Posada Hotel on that site right now, it would be illegal to build. And so Measure G actually seeks to make it legal to build that type of structure again. And That's another thing that's important to note, is that in the Redlands Transit Village's specific plan, it actually dictates things like the architectural styles of the buildings, and so it really seeks to emulate some of our favorite buildings that already exist in town. So things like the Smiley Library, and so this actually gives the city. Basically, any developer that comes in, they have to honor those regulations and restrictions. It shows it's everything from, you know, variable heights on buildings to the actual construction to the walkable infrastructure to the landscaping. It's all been considered. Yeah. So that's why I think it's really important. If you don't know how to vote on Measure G, I can't recommend enough. You need to look at the Redlands Transit Village's specific plan, because it takes everything into consideration. The consultants that worked on it, they're based out of Pasadena, and they have done amazing work. I went to their website, and I could not believe they had these gorgeous multi-level Spanish-style buildings that they've primarily done in Pasadena, and we could see things like that on a smaller scale, on a scale that fits Redlands.
So we could see like another Burge Mansion or another Kimberly Crest get built in these areas where it would be illegal to build that now.
Yeah, it is currently illegal to build anything taller than 2 stories in all of Redlands, I believe.
Okay.
And I think that's another thing. This is kind of an aside, so I don't know if you want to, if you can like squeeze this in. But a lot of people, they get really upset when they hear about apartments, because they think about the new apartments that are going up in the donut hole. And I think one thing that people don't understand is that the reason it's called the donut hole is because it's not Redlands. Yeah. That's actually under the jurisdiction of the county of San Bernardino, and Redlands has no control over that property. Yeah. Nothing like that will be built in Redlands proper. If you look at the Redlands Transit Village's specific plan, nothing like that would be permitted. And so I think that's really important. We're not talking about putting a strip mall in where the Redlands Mall property is. Yeah. We're not talking about putting garden-style apartments there, condos, anything like what you see.
Or another Citrus Plaza.
Yeah, it's not going to be Citrus Plaza. Okay. We're talking about basically something that mirrors what we already have downtown, but with apartments and offices above.